she basically said something to the effect of, like, at some point, if you're not writing about climate change, you're just not going to be writing about reality anymore, right? Because climate change is here. It's been here, for a little while now, at least for a huge chunk of the world.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the podcast that explores the intersection between science, story and play, Geekoscopy 101, with me, your host, Dr. Yanis Kistin. And today we're exploring climate change, climate fiction and podcasting with the founder of Stories for Earth, Forrest Brown. Welcome to the show, Forrest. How are you doing?
Thanks. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on the show.
You and I probably inhabit similar niches, not leeches,
yeah.
along with Lovis.
Sure.
As well, talking about, I suppose, pop culture and how, like, kind of science fits in, but you guys are more on the environmental kind of climate change type of side, specific.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us a bit about yourself, who you feel you are in this moment, and what you do.
Yeah, so like you said, my name is Forrest. I started a podcast called Stories for Earth. I guess it's been a little bit over 2 years ago now, actually, which is kind of hard to believe. But yeah, I started that kind of because I was terrified, is what I usually tell people. Climate change scares the crap out of me. And I was kind of looking for a way that I could get involved and, like, I guess do my part to help beyond just the little things that, people always tell you to do, like cut down on plastic waste and drive less and that sort of thing. So I don't have any kind of formal science education. I actually studied music business in university. But I've always had, like, a really strong interest in literature. I've been a writer for as long as I can remember. So it made sense for me to, I guess, look at how stories told through a number of different mediums might, I guess, kind of help us prepare for what's to come with the climate crisis and, like, what we can do now in terms of both, like, mitigation and adaptation. So yeah, that's kind of how I got started in this space. But yeah, outside of that, I have a day job, so I work like a regular boring business job, and I'm a writer in my spare time, whatever little spare time I have these days. I try to work on writing fiction. And then, of course, I write a ton for the podcast. All the episodes are scripted if they're not an interview. So that's a lot of writing, actually. Yeah, that's me.
Yeah. How did you gravitate towards doing a scripted podcast as a medium for your show?
Because doing a non-scripted podcast went terribly. So I started out... So when I started it, I was like, okay, if I'm going to do this, like, realistically, if I'm going to, do the number of episodes, talk about the number of different stories that I want to talk about, I'm going to have to set, like, some kind of expectations about, like, how I'm going to do this to make it feasible, with the little amount of time that I have to devote to it. So at first I was like, okay, well, yeah, I mean, it probably wouldn't be too bad if I just did bullet points and just kind of, I guess, improvised a little bit. Like, I could just talk about it naturally. Turns out, for me anyway, it's really hard to talk naturally about something when it's only you alone in a room talking to a microphone. I was like, I'll just do it like I'm talking to a friend. But I don't know, for me anyway, I felt like it sounded weird, and it actually took a lot longer to do it that way, I thought, because, like I said, I'm a writer, I'm not like a speaker, so it doesn't come as naturally to me to just kind of go off the cuff like that. So after I did, I think, 2 episodes without scripting them, I just kind of did like a really structured outline, which are the first 2 episodes I ever released, which was Parable of the Sower and then Parable of the Talents by Octavia E. Butler. After I did those 2, I was like, okay, these episodes are getting way too long. Like, I ramble. Like, I feel like I'm not really getting my points across clearly. So after that, I was like, okay, well, I guess I have to try writing it, because I don't want to really keep doing this if all of them are going to be like that. So I did. I started writing them, and it actually didn't take as long as I thought it would. It was actually faster, I thought, than doing them unscripted. And yeah, I just never really stopped. So some of them have gotten kind of long. They've taken me a lot longer to write than others, which has been okay. Like I think I did one on 2 books by Amitav Ghosh. One was The Great Derangement, which is a nonfiction work, and then one of his more recent novels, which is Gun Island. And that episode, after I recorded it, that was like 30 minutes long, which is pretty long if you're writing something. I think it was like 7,000 words or something, which took a long time. So yeah, so it's just kind of like a natural thing. It just kind of made sense to do it that way, I thought.
What inspired you to get into podcasting in general?
I mean, I do listen to a lot of podcasts, especially when I started doing this podcast. I was really listening to a lot of podcasts because that was back before the world fell apart, and I actually had a commute. So when I was driving to work every day, I would just listen to podcasts and audiobook the whole way. So I didn't have like a terribly long commute, but it was like just a perfect amount of time for a podcast. It was like 30 or 45 minutes driving. It was even longer if I tried to take public transportation. I used to live in Nashville, Tennessee, which is, one state north of where I live now. But it's a much smaller city than Atlanta, but it has like no public transportation infrastructure. Essentially, it's very, very limited, and like there's a reason for that, and it's big money. But yeah, it like a 30-minute car ride would take me like almost 2 hours to get to work. So I tried to do that a couple times. Back to what I was saying about like the trying to minimize your, I guess, environmental footprint, so to speak, which is a term that was invented by oil companies. But yeah, after doing that a couple of times, I was like, this is I guess better for the environment, but it's also extremely impractical. This is kind of one of those situations where I'm going to unfortunately have to draw a line. But yeah, so I mean, I guess I started out by thinking that I would do Stories for Earth as like a blog. I'd done that before. I'd had like multiple different blogs in the past. I'd started by thinking I would maybe make the podcast, or what eventually became the podcast, a blog. So like I'd, had WordPress websites in the past. I'd like done some stuff on medium.com. But I was kind of like, I don't know if anybody actually reads blogs anymore. Like by the time that I was making this, which they do, but I wasn't sure at the time when I was making it. So I'd kind of thought about making a podcast before. The ideas that I had before were like nothing like this. They were always like stupid stuff, like just goofy, like funny stuff with friends that we just kind of like joked about it. We weren't actually serious, but yeah, I was like, well, this might actually be like a good medium to communicate what I'm trying to get across, because podcasting is getting really big. At the time, everybody was like, oh, like podcasts are finally taking off after, like how many years they've been around, which now like podcasts are huge and they're all over the place. But I feel like when I started it, people were just finally starting to like realize like how big podcasts were getting, and there were some bigger shows popping up and stuff. But so yeah, I decided to give it a go. It was I looked into it. It was surprisingly easy to get started. It was much I felt like it was much less of like an upfront investment than starting something like a YouTube channel, where I would have to get like a camera and stuff, which I didn't have. I still don't have. Those are pretty expensive. So I've got this microphone here that I'm talking to you through. Had it since I was like in high school, I think. Still works okay. It's not like a super nice microphone, but it works for podcasting. So I was like, well, I could try it. If it's terrible, I don't have to keep doing it, but like, let's just see how it goes. So I started it and I still haven't really stopped. So that's how the podcast came about.
Yeah. So reminder of yours what the premise of Stories for Earth is.
Yeah, it's so I guess the little spiel that I always do at the beginning of my episodes is Stories for Earth is a podcast about everything climate change and pop culture. So I used to have a much more like, I guess, kind of academic sounding thing, but I was afraid it would put people off. So it was like like I forgot what it was. It was like cultural artifacts or something like that examine the climate crisis or something.
Deep,
yeah. And I was like, this actually doesn't. I don't even know if I know what this means, so I changed it. But no, the basic premise is that I'm looking at stories told through a number of different mediums. So that's like, I talk a lot about books, but it's not only books. I also have been trying to kind of expand the medium diversity, if you will, that I cover on the show. So it's also film. I've done two on video games now. One was an interview, one was a scripted episode on Final Fantasy VII. And I've done, poetry is one that I've done before. I'd like to do some more of that. I think that might be it up until now, but if there's basically like any kind of storytelling medium that I feel like tells a good story that could be useful or like have some kind of good insights or lessons to teach us about facing the climate emergency, it's something that I'm interested in talking about. So I'm pretty open-minded when it comes to like medium. I'm more interested in the story part. So yeah, that's the basic premise of the show.
How do you feel about storytelling as a medium for climate awareness over other types of climate action? Like, what's different about it, and why do you think it's important?
Like, I guess storytelling is, it's obviously why I started the podcast. It's something that I was thinking about a lot. So in my day job, I work as a marketer, actually. So it's like storytelling for money. It's kind of like being a storytelling mercenary.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah, so
that's a good way of putting it, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of skeezy, but yeah, everybody hates marketers and PR people, but I did both. I worked in marketing and PR.
Yeah. No, I mean, marketers are one of those things that's like really important to businesses. So, I mean, they help kind of run the world. But they do kind of destroy everything for everyone. They make everything like kind of boring over time. So anything that comes out that's kind of new, like once marketers get a hold of it, that's when it gets old.
Well, you're welcome. That's neat. Thankfully, I usually am doing stuff that you probably haven't ever heard of. It's more like boring, like business to business kind of stuff.
For
like,
sure, yeah.
But anyway, yeah, so storytelling is always something I've been really interested in. Like I said, I'm a writer outside of working for money. So I'm always thinking about, like, I guess, the power of stories and like how you can, I guess, try to use a story to persuade someone to your point of view, or to, you know, make some, perhaps like increase empathy or something like that. So I was, and this is still something I'm interested in, but I guess when I was first thinking about like what can I do to help with the climate crisis, and one thing was that I came across was like environmental communication. So it's like science communication essentially, but specifically targeted for environmentalism. So I was actually looking at going to grad school, which did not pan out. But yeah, I was thinking that I would essentially work in, I guess, kind of like almost like science communication, public health communication kind of space, just to make like public relations campaigns or marketing campaigns to, like, I guess, drive action on climate change broadly was like my thinking. So I was having a really hard time finding jobs like that, actually. And after a while I was like, you know what, like, why does this have to be like a job? Like, why do I have to make money to do this? I could just do it. I could just make a podcast. I mean, maybe it won't have like as much of an impact, you know, you could argue, but at least I'd be doing something. So, and I could still figure out the other thing along the way. So that's kind of what I started doing. And yeah, I mean, just the more I was learning about environmental communication, I actually bought a textbook on environmental communication. So I'm like a person who read a textbook for fun. That tells you anything about I guess the nature of the show or whatever. But yeah, so I mean, a big piece of it kept coming back to storytelling, which makes sense for me with my background, because like humans are storytelling animals. We're like, stories are the way that we essentially shape reality. It's the way that we make sense of the world. So I was like, oh, well, that is something that could actually be really useful for climate action. If not for at least just, I feel like, people always say raise awareness. I don't really know how much more raising awareness we need to do about the climate crisis. I feel like the awareness is pretty raised at this point. But I was like, a big thing that I was coming across in environmental communication is that I guess there's this kind of debate that's still going on. Like, we've been talking about it for even since before I knew what environmental communication was. But there's like the whole kind of debate between like, do you use like scare messaging to like, I guess, kind of scare people into taking action? Like, do you use like fear as a motivator, or do you try to do like I guess like more like empowering people and I guess providing like a hopeful message? That's kind of like a simplified version of the debate, but that's like that's kind of what's going on there. So but yeah, I mean, like a big part of that was that the concern is that if you go too far into like scare tactics, that you basically, it's like the whole fight or flight thing, or freeze. So instead of people fleeing, they just freeze and they don't do anything because they just feel like they have no sense of agency or like self-efficacy. So that's something that I thought stories could really help with, was giving people more of a sense of agency. Because like when you're reading a story, you kind of see yourself as the protagonist, like inevitably, or at least I feel like most people do. I feel like I tend to do that a lot. But yeah, I thought, like if we maybe looked at the right kind of stories, or like some really good stories that would have some good takeaways for a problem as big as the climate crisis, that maybe that could help people, one, have like a better sense of self-efficacy, better sense of agency, to feel like they could actually do something about the climate crisis, which people can. And then two, to also help people imagine what like a more sustainable world would look like, which is something that I feel like is a big struggle for a lot of people. It's kind of like, a fish doesn't know it's in water until it's, out of water. So it's kind of hard to realize like what kind of cultural or societal constructs are around you, like until you see something different or better, I guess. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
I suppose
yeah,
it does make sense. It's just giving you more context to change your worldview. To understand a certain concept, which is important. Yeah, because it's like you don't realize how many things you kind of take for granted all the time, or just how many things you accept as normal, until maybe you're presented with like an alternative vision of like what the world could be like in a more, I guess, sustainable world, if you will, or more like fair and just world too. So yeah, those are and not like every story that I talk about is going to be like this utopian dream world. I've actually only really talked about a handful of those, although utopias are something I'm really interested in. So a lot of them kind of, at least in the Cli-Fi space, tend to lean towards dystopian. But I kind of like to think that those, those are kind of, like I guess vulgar generalizations of complicated stories. So they kind of are like two sides of the same coin in my mind. And even if it's something that is like something people often say is dystopian, like a book like Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler, if you read it critically, there's actually a lot of like pretty radical like utopian ideas in there, I think. Especially, I don't know if you're familiar with the book or not, but especially with like okay, it's a really good one. But yeah, that's like the main character essentially like invents a religion to help her like deal with I guess the climate collapsing, essentially, is what's happening in that book. And there's actually a bunch of really good stuff in there that's I feel like pretty practical to us today. That could actually help a lot of people. And lo and behold, there are actually some people who have, I guess, kind of organized that as a real religion and subscribe to that in real life, which is pretty fascinating. So in the book, she says it's a religion. I kind of think of it more as
something like a philosophical framework, something. It's not something like I guess Christianity or something. In my mind, it's something kind of more similar to Buddhism or Taoism, which of course are religions, but it's not like, I guess, the same kind of thing that you typically think of in, like a Judeo-Christian sense, I guess. But yeah, I feel like I'm kind of rambling here, but I feel like, that's the power of stories.
That's the thing. There's so many different facets to stories and how they affect the human psyche and how they, kind of form somebody's worldview. That's really important. And I mean, I've had a few scientists on here that have used storytelling in their, in whatever form of science communication, and it's always something that comes up as primarily important. So it's good to hear from somebody who works in the marketing space to tell us about how interesting storytelling is into making people purchase something. That's part of, that's a decision somebody is making with their money. And like one of the things that I've always thought for a long time, even discussed with my other colleagues, is that science and environmentalism has a big marketing problem. And it's not done in a way that provokes any kind of action or provokes any kind of change in behavior. It's like you said, a lot of it is like scaring people. Yeah. And trying to scare them into action, which I think is it works maybe for some people, but I think
for sure
the large majority of people are just trying to put like food on the table and like getting from meal to meal or paycheck to paycheck, and worrying about something that's, maybe 50 years in the future is going to take up very little in their mind. So we need to kind of diversify how we try and communicate these things and how we try and get them to understand it and take action, because doing it one way may not be the best, and if we're doing it wrong, we're not going to figure that out until like a few years when somebody does a research study and it's like, oh, we're doing this the wrong way, we need to change it. Which is kind of like the slow way that academia in particular operates compared to like, the corporate world with corporate marketing. I think things are changing now. I think since the pandemic hit, like you said, you're struggling to find jobs. Those jobs in communications now in science and environmentalism are just like exponentially increased over the past year. Oh yeah,
I've definitely noticed that.
So I think governments have understood and institutions have understood. Research around science communication is increasing. So, I mean, there's movement. It's taken a while, but there's movement now.
Which is definitely a lot of positive signs.
Yeah, definitely gives us content to create as well.
And I would say there actually have been some studies done, like formal academic studies done on, I guess, like the impact of climate fiction or eco-fiction on, I guess, like swaying people one way or the other, or like changing their opinions, perhaps about climate change. And at least like I haven't like read the studies in detail. That's like something that's been on my to-do list for a long time actually. But I feel like there was one that came out last year, maybe it was the end of 2019. But yeah, it was basically like I don't know if the effect is like permanent or like really long lasting, but it does at least have a pretty strong short-term impact at the very least. And it's just like you were saying, like different messages reach different people in different ways. So I'm sure for some people it probably does have a much more lasting effect. People like me, for instance, or people who presumably would listen to a podcast like mine or yours. So yeah, it's there's been some research done on it, and it's pretty interesting to, I guess, read about some of it. But yeah, I guess it's something that's kind of growing right now. And
what are some of your favorite Cli-Fi titles?
Yeah, good question. So I'm actually going to kind of cheat a little bit and borrow off of a blog post that I wrote last year.
That's totally fine. It's still coming from your brain.
Yeah, it's just something that I wrote down in the past. But because I've like done so many, sometimes I forget about some good ones. So I just want to make sure that I wasn't missing anything. So yeah, if you want to read the blog post, it's on storiesforearth.com. It's called Where to Get Started with Cli-Fi. But yeah, I mean, I've already mentioned it, but the number one book that I would recommend to people who are just getting started is Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. This is, I mean, like if you Google anything about climate fiction, this is going to come up. It's probably like one of the best known books about climate fiction, but for a really good reason. So I know you said you haven't read the book, but it's just like, it's incredible that it was written when it was written. I'll say that because it was, I think, published in 1998 or something like that. But
geez, that's a while ago.
Man, it's like you read it and you're like, I feel like I'm reading the news like from last year. It's actually kind of scary. So yeah, it's just wild how prescient it is. And of course, like Octavia E. Butler was like one of the greatest American writers ever. Especially like one of the greatest science fiction writers ever. She was just an incredible writer of science fiction. So that certainly doesn't hurt it either. But yeah, that's a really good one to start with. Actually, our mutual friend Lovis Geyer, the two of us recently did a podcast episode about that book. It's on YouTube, on her YouTube channel, if you want to find it, on Ecofictology with Lovis Geyer, where we kind of just broke it down and talked about our reactions to it. So some people are like, oh, you shouldn't recommend that one as the one to start with because it's kind of dystopian. It might scare some people, but I would say if you do read it, you know, if it does scare you, like don't read it. Like you can totally not finish a book, it's fine. But if you do read it, like focus on the more utopian kind of things in it that I was thinking of, like the parts where it's kind of like imagining a better future and actually kind of laying the groundwork for that. So in terms of a novel, that's like the big one I would recommend. I kind of like to give people like a range of stuff, but if you are looking for a film, I feel like whenever people think of like climate change in movies, and I think we were emailing back and forth about this before we started the podcast, but at least in my mind, the one that would always come to mind first is The Day After Tomorrow, which came out in 2004.
Oh yeah.
I remember watching that as a kid and just being like, oh my God, this is so scary. You know, it's
a really good movie. I've seen it.
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe 100 times.
I watched it a bunch. Yeah.
It's a really entertaining movie, even though
it is like entertaining. I don't know how scientifically accurate it is, but
it's so wild in terms of like what's going on with the climate. Like it's crazy. Like that kind of change you would expect like will take centuries at the very least. But it's just so wild in terms of this is how much your life can change. You know, if you carry on trying to change the climate, it's gonna be terrible to live.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that I mean, again, not a scientist, but in the movie, so like the reason for like the rapid climate change that happened in that movie, which was actually like a new ice age instead of like the world getting hotter overall, which is, I guess, like one possibility that has been kind of floated around like in the past. I don't think anybody thinks that's a possibility now, but it's based off kind of a crazy book too. If you do any reading about the making of the film, but yeah, I think the premise is like I think it was like the East Atlantic Current or something like that. It's basically like a you know, really important ocean current in the Atlantic Ocean that evenly distributes like warm and cold water to make temperate climates. Basically that's just slows down and almost completely comes to a stop. So then it's just like there's no warm water being circulated up towards like the northern hemisphere, and climates that were once temperate like Europe and like North America, or at least the United States section of North America, just essentially turn into an ice age and like tundra. So but apparently like I think that current is actually, there are some signs of it slowing down in real life, so I don't think that there's any chance of there being a scenario like that movie actually happening, but just a fun fact.
We just plain stops.
Yeah.
Slowing down, maybe. But the thing is, like, there's so many factors involved. Like, it's got more to do with, like, the rotation of the Earth and, like, where currents are hitting, like, continents and more, a lot to do with wind and stuff. So for it to just, like, for the ocean conveyor to just stop one day...
No, that's not going to happen.
It's kind of weird. It's not going to happen,
No, but it makes for an entertaining
course,
movie. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah.
It's an interesting concept.
But talking a lot about The Day After Tomorrow, the movie that I would actually recommend watching instead of that one, not that that one is a bad movie necessarily, but it's just like a Hollywood action film. The one that I would actually recommend watching is one called Beasts of the Southern Wild. And this was an independent film that I can't remember now when it came out. 2012, I think, is when it was released. But it is actually set in the United States Gulf Coast. So think like New Orleans, that kind of area. And it follows the life of this little girl named Hush Puppy who's growing up in this, I guess, town that you'd call like, I think they call it the Bathtub is the name of the town. And it's kind of just like one of these little small, like kind of like coastal parish towns that you might find in Louisiana or like Mississippi. It's pretty poor, like it's really small. Hush Puppy's growing up in like a trailer home. But then basically there's this really big storm that comes. A lot of people kind of see parallels between it and like Hurricane Katrina, which happened in 2004. And it essentially like floods the whole bathtub, and they have like FEMA comes in, you know, the government comes in, evacuates the whole town, like forces them to migrate basically. But like there's also this kind of magical realism element to it, which I really love. Magical realism is like one of my favorite genres of literature. So I guess the reason for the storm happening is that in the movie there are like these like kind of mythical beasts, which is where the beasts part of the film title comes from. But these beasts are called aurochs, and they're like an extinct kind of like bovine sort of animal. They kind of look like buffalo or something that have been extinct for like, you know, a really, really long time. I think they were actually a real animal in the Ice Age or something. But basically like in the movie, they're like trapped under the ice in like Antarctica or like the North Pole or something like that. And they break free from the ice, and like it's kind of like a metaphor for climate change. So by them like breaking free from the ice, it's kind of like the ice melting at the polar ice caps, and it's like the ocean level rises and the bathtub basically drowns. So the waters do eventually recede later in the movie, and Hush Puppy actually confronts the beast herself. And I don't know, I'm actually kind of getting chills talking about it. It's such a powerful movie. But yeah, it's one you can find. It might be on Netflix actually. And of course I know that the availability of film titles on streaming platforms varies depending on where you live, but you can probably find it somewhere on the internet where you can watch it. But it's a really, really, really good movie. I feel like it's kind of underrated, but it's like one of my top 10 favorite movies ever. Apart from just being a really good Cli-Fi movie. So that's another really good one that I would recommend. And then, not to rattle on for too long, but I think the last title that I would recommend people check out is another book. It's another work of fiction. It's called Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. Again, it was published, I think, in the 90s, might have been the 80s. But it's there's only two characters in the book. So it's like a Socratic dialogue is the way that it's structured. So it's between a man who's responding to an ad in a newspaper that he saw, and a gorilla who has learned to talk. And he's escaped from the zoo, and he kind of is like a stand-in, like representing all of, I guess, like the natural world, you might say. But the gorilla is named Ishmael, and Ishmael puts an ad in the newspaper one day. And he's like, if anybody's interested in saving the world, like come, you know, apply for this job or whatever. So the guy who responds to the job ad in the newspaper is the other person in the story. We never actually learn his name, but it's really interesting. It's almost like a piece of like philosophy, actually. It's written very accessibly, so like anybody can read it and take something really meaningful from it, I think. But it's really getting at some pretty big questions about like the way that I guess modern industrialized society is set up, and how it's just like inherently, I guess, antithetical to having a sustainable world, and just like the mindset that so many people have, and the way that they think about, you know, like humankind versus nature. I mean, it's really the same thing. You know, there's no distinction between humankind and nature. It's all the same. And yeah, it's really interesting. And a lot of that book is actually about storytelling. So, and in the book, he actually refers to it as mythology instead of storytelling, but it's the same concept. So, it's basically like learning to look around you and examine like what is the kind of like controlling mythology of your culture. And you know, like it's easy to look in the past to say like ancient Rome and see like what their kind of controlling mythology was, but it's much more difficult when you're actually in the present, trying to like look around you and think like, what kind of mythologies do I subscribe to that kind of like inform how I engage with the world. And then learning how to kind of break free from that to, I guess, invent a better mythology. And I don't know. I think that one is like a really good setup for reading any other kind of climate fiction, because I think it kind of sets like the headspace that you'd want to be in when you're reading climate fiction, or at least from my perspective, because it's like, okay, like now that we are on the same page in terms of like what's wrong with the way that the stories that we're currently telling about like ourselves in the world, what are some better stories that we could explore to, I guess, kind of make things better and, you know, help with things like climate change, or like species extinction, mass extinction, you know, like injustice around the world, that sort of thing, like colonialism, all kinds of these different huge issues that we have that we're still contending with, and that we're might get worse in the future. So yeah, those are probably like the three big ones I would recommend. That was a really long answer to your short question, but yeah, those are the three titles I would recommend people checking out if they want to get into climate fiction or eco fiction.
I noticed you didn't have a video game, which is disappointing.
I can tell you one though. I did do one on Final Fantasy VII. I mentioned that's like the one scripted episode I've done. I've been trying to find like some other ones that I can do too, because I think that video games are often overlooked as like a good source of storytelling, because there are some video games with really, really good stories. And Final Fantasy titles are always going to be in that category. They're very cinematic, or at least most of them, like the newer ones are. So Final Fantasy VII is a really interesting one, because not only is Final Fantasy VII, it might be like the best-selling video game ever made. Certainly one of the most popular video games ever made.
Sure.
I don't know if someone else has, if another title has taken that crown by now, but yeah, and also at the time that I was writing the podcast episode about it, I didn't know this. This was just kind of like synchronicity, but they were actually just released a remake of the game for, you know, like PS5 or whatever it is now. I don't know. But the original game came out for PlayStation, the original PlayStation. It was set, the story is really complicated, but basically it's like Cloud Strife is the main character. He's like the spiky haired guy with a big, huge, ridiculous looking sword. And he lives in a city called Midgar, which is essentially kind of like a company town controlled by this like giant corporation that's essentially like the size of a government, called the Shinova Energy Corporation. And they're essentially like a massive fossil fuel company that is just like destroying the world. And, you know, they have basically created like this dystopian kind of world where it's like tons and tons of income inequality. Actually, I think where Cloud lives is actually like on a bottom like level of the city. There's like multiple levels of the city, and like the higher up you go, like the more wealthy you are. So yeah, it's pretty there's a lot of actually really deep stuff in there that you wouldn't expect to find in a video game maybe. But yeah, it's basically the man, I think I got the name of the energy company wrong. I think it's the Shinra Electric Power Company.
Shinra.
Yeah, I think I called it something else. But yeah, it's they basically have found a way to like mine or like drill like the life force of the planet to produce energy. So I think it's called Mako energy in the game. And like in the game, like Mako energy literally is like the soul of the planet. And they're like essentially converting like the spirit of the planet into energy so that they can, you know, like fuel cars and, you know, make electricity and that kind of thing. And it's like literally just draining the life from the planet to make electricity, which is a pretty strong metaphor, I think. So that game I mean, you can play it. I actually haven't played it all the way through. I've played it once when I was a kid, but, you know, you can like watch gameplay of it online. Like I said, there's a remake of it now for one of the newer PlayStation consoles. And there's people who have done a much better job recapping it than I have, who can maybe show you a little bit more about the story if you're interested in that aspect of it. But yeah, it's a really, really interesting one. So, and I think it's especially good because not only is the story really interesting, but also the game is just really engaging. It's like a game that you would want to play even if you didn't know anything about the story of the game, which I think is really important for effective storytelling. So yeah, that's probably at least the one that comes to mind immediately that I would check out for a video game, but I'm sure there are others that I haven't gotten to yet. So there's a lot out there.
Yeah, I'm sure there are some, but I mean, for me, I mean, I've been gaming for most of my life, but Cli-Fi games, like none of them, nothing comes to mind.
Yeah,
which is kind of weird. I think a lot of games like allude to it, like in like background or environmental storytelling, or either use metaphors. Like I think Final Fantasy X is kind of like similar to 7, but I think the central conflict is more magical and more like analogous.
Yeah.
Versus in 7 where it's like, okay, there is a company that's using stuff.
Yeah.
Whereas in 10 it's more like mystical and religious.
I almost did that game instead of Final Fantasy VII actually. So last year when the pandemic hit, you know, like a lot of people, I was just like in full crisis mode, like having like a quarter life crisis, sort of like going back and revisiting like old video games and stuff from my childhood, because it was kind of comforting, I guess. But I actually played back through Final Fantasy X, and yeah, I was playing through it and I was like, this is actually really interesting from a story perspective. There's a lot of things I hadn't thought about. You know, obviously as a kid I didn't know about any of this stuff, so I wouldn't have picked up on it. But you know, like in the game, it's like there's this huge conflict, kind of like a cultural conflict in the world that the game is set in, where it's like sinful to use machinery, and it's like there's a huge faction of like the dominant religion in the world, I guess like the more conservative, if you will, people who subscribe to that religion all think it's sinful to use machina, is what they call it in the game. It's just any kind of like industrialized you know, machinery or whatever. But then there are people who are considered like infidels, so in the game I think they're the Albed, and they use machina and they're considered kind of like infidels by the rest of the people, and they're like sinners or whatever. So yeah, it's interesting because in that game they think that the reason it's sinful to use machina is because it like attracts well, the name of the monster is sin, but it doesn't actually have any correlation
this
to
creature
sin.
That's basically a natural disaster.
The creature is just like an embodiment of a natural disaster, so it might be like come in the form of like a typhoon or like an earthquake or whatever, but it always kind of takes the form of a natural disaster. So they think that by using like machina that it's I guess like inviting sin to like come and destroy them. And in the game, it's like every, like 7 years or something, sin is reborn and, you know, goes on this like campaign of destruction again, and they have to try to stop it. So yeah, I mean, there's some interesting things going on there for sure. It might be one that I guess revisit in the future, but it's cool. A lot of cool things there. And sorry, I don't want to keep you for too long. I know that we've got a limited amount of time, but you've got me thinking about this now.
No, it's true. I'm just saying, it's when it comes to video games, I think it's less thrown in your face. If there are
totally.
any Cli-Fi, instances or references, I think it's toned down, but I think it's changing.
Yeah.
There are games now like Beyond Blue, where science and environmentalism is more baked into the game.
That's interesting.
Which is, so I think in the future you're going to get gaming companies that are kind of partnering with institutions and like non-governmental organizations and to create games that are, for the purpose of either science communication or environmental awareness, which is going to be interesting and cool.
Yeah, totally.
Going forward.
And
yeah.
Oh, sorry. One more thing I would add to that is just that there's this really great quote from Margaret Atwood, the science fiction writer. She wrote, like The Handmaid's Tale and stuff, but really, really famous science fiction writer. But she's got this really great quote that I'll paraphrase, and she basically said something to the effect of, at some point, if you're not writing about climate change, you're just not going to be writing about reality anymore, right? Because climate change is here. It's been here, for a little while now, at least for a huge chunk of the world. Although it feels like this year it was just like people in the Northern Hemisphere and a lot of places like in Europe and the United States were like, oh my gosh, climate change is here. And the rest of the world was like, where have you guys been? It's been here. I don't know what you're talking about. But so she was like, climate change is like everything change. So, there will come a point where if you're a writer and you're not writing, like if your storytelling doesn't involve climate change to some extent, you're just, completely out of touch with reality, and you just won't be a good writer anymore, basically. And, that goes for any kind of storytelling. So that just seems kind of relevant to video games.
For sure. I think that's a good place to end. Otherwise, we'll continue for the next 4 hours talking about different climate fictions.
I could talk about this for a really long time. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So why don't you let everybody know where they can find your work on the internet?
Sure. As I mentioned, I've got a website. You can find like transcripts for most of the episodes there. You can at least find links to listen to all of them there. It's storiesforearth.com. And I'm also on social media. I don't have a Facebook, but I'm on Instagram and Twitter. So if you just search Stories for Earth, it'll come up there. And I'm on YouTube as well. I am not very good about staying consistent about uploading on YouTube, but I do try to keep that up as well. So, I'm on all major podcasting platforms. So just search Stories for Earth wherever you get podcasts and I'll come up.
Sure. Go check that. Thanks so much, Forrest, for joining. It's been a really fun chat.
All right. Thank you for having me. It was great getting to come on the show.